When you hear anarchist, you likely picture street riots and broken windows. But within academic political philosophy, anarchism is an extensive, highly structured framework. This diagram breaks down the Greek root of the word. Arche translates to first principle or ruling power. Adding the prefix an negates it, creating anarche, meaning simply non-rule. At its core, philosophical anarchism asks a single skeptical question. What inherently justifies a centralized authority's right to exist? Asking this question doesn't automatically mandate throwing a brick through a window to destroy the system. Instead, anarchists treat the modern state as a hypothesis. They argue it is not an inevitable fact of nature, but a highly specific human arrangement that must rigorously prove its moral and mathematical right to govern us. To test that hypothesis, we have to start with an epistemological baseline. A state, by definition, is an entity that holds a coercive monopoly on legitimate violence. The linguist and political theorist Noam Chomsky formalized how anarchists evaluate that coercion. This scale visualizes Chomsky's burden of proof. Because the state relies on force, the prima facie assumption is that the state is unjustified. The burden lies entirely on the government to provide overwhelming moral justification. Mainstream theory assumes the state successfully meets that burden. Anarchists assert the justification shatters under scrutiny, leaving the state's legitimacy void. To understand exactly why the state fails this test, we can map the varying schools of anarchist thought across a two-dimensional grid. This coordinate plane maps the architecture of non-rule. We will define the vertical y-axis as the specific methodology of critique used to prove the state is illegitimate. The top of this axis represents a priori or deontological anarchism. Deontology is an ethical framework that judges the morality of an action based on its adherence to a strict rule or duty, regardless of the outcome. The philosopher Robert Paul Wolff anchors this position. He argues that for a state to be legitimate, it must have a definitive right to command. For that right to exist, citizens must have a corresponding moral duty to obey. But Wolff identifies a fatal contradiction. Human beings possess a superseding moral duty to maintain their own rational autonomy, their ability to reason and make independent choices. Because submitting to a state requires surrendering that autonomy, a legally legitimate state is a logical impossibility. The bottom of the y-axis represents a posteriori or consequentialist anarchism. This approach evaluates the state based entirely on its real-world outcomes. Thinkers like William Godwin concede that a state could theoretically be justified. However, they look at historical data and observe that states consistently function as engines of classism, inequality, and oppression. They failed the test in practice. The vertical axis traps the concept of the state. It is either mathematically illegitimate by its fundamental definition, or it is empirically illegitimate due to its historical failure. The horizontal x-axis maps the post-state vision. This is where anarchist philosophy fractures into deeply opposing schools of thought regarding what socioeconomic architecture should replace the government. The left side of the axis is defined by individualist anarchism, which is rooted in negative liberty, the concept of freedom as the total absence of external constraints or interference. The 19th century philosopher Max Stirner built the foundation for this quadrant. He viewed both the state and communal social obligations as despotic forces that suppress a person's unique individuality and self-will. The right side of the axis represents communitarian or socialist anarchism. This quadrant is driven by positive liberty, the idea that true freedom requires having the active resources and community support to actually realize your potential. Peter Kropotkin sharply criticized the individualistic approach. He argued for decentralized, non-hierarchical communes structured around mutual aid, where humans naturally cooperate to survive. Kropotkin summarized this economic goal as all for all, meaning collective wealth generated by humanity should be freely accessible to everyone without centralized control. Anarchism divides sharply over this single question. Does achieving true liberty require total freedom from the collective, or is it only possible through the collective? This completed matrix reveals a highly structured blueprint, bringing us to an obvious paradox. How do any of these theorists expect millions of people to coordinate global trade, infrastructure, and human rights without a central authority? The answer lies in the strict distinction between non-rule and no rules. Anarchism does not advocate for an absence of structure. Instead of relying on a ruling class or the tyranny of a 51% majority, many anarchists propose unanimous direct democracy. This is a system where decisions are made by complete consensus, ensuring no minority is forced to submit. Under this framework, complex institutions can still exist. The defining requirement is that their compliance structures must remain open-ended and strictly voluntary. The grid we've mapped is not a design for a power vacuum. It is a demand for a vastly more difficult, highly consensual system of human coordination. This leads to what critics call the toothless objection. If a philosopher uses this logic to prove the state is illegitimate, are they hypocrites if they still pay their taxes and stop at red lights? Theorists like A. John Simmons and Jesse Spafford resolve this with state-tolerant anarchism. They argue that proving a state lacks moral legitimacy does not automatically create a strict moral obligation to dismantle it. This flowchart maps the action gap. Once you accept the philosophical premise of anarchism, your response branches into 3 distinct ethical choices for action. The first branch is pacifism and submission. The novelist Leo Tolstoy championed a Christian anarchist approach. He argued that because the state is intrinsically tied to violent military power, the only moral response is total, non-violent disengagement and passive submission. Recognizing the state's illegitimacy does not inherently mandate a violent response. Passive non-compliance is a logically complete conclusion. The second branch of the action gap rejects submission in favor of direct action and revolution. Activists like Emma Goldman argued that because the state relies on systemic violence and economic exploitation, physical sabotage and revolutionary disruption are ethically justified forms of self-defense. However, this creates deep friction within the movement regarding the unity of means and ends. Many anarchists point out that using coercive violence to force a stateless society into existence simply rebuilds the exact hierarchical domination they are trying to escape. This leads to the third branch, separatism and reform. This is the choice to opt out of the system entirely, to build temporary autonomous zones. Historically, this takes the form of utopian communes. These are experimental proving grounds meant to physically demonstrate that human beings can cooperate and survive off the grid without coercive authority. This slow cultural reform stands in stark contrast to the revolutionary demand to immediately destroy the system from within. Whether an individual chooses pacifism, builds a commune, or plans a revolution, philosophical anarchism serves as a relentless analytical stress test. It forces us to remember that sovereign power is not a moral absolute we must revere. It is merely a historical contingency we currently tolerate.